good morning. Everyone can hear me, right? Thank you. Okay, so I'm Rui Ling. I'm a PhD student at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Welcome to our symposium on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So given the recent Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, more and more organizations want to increase diversity. However, it is not clear how exactly they can do so. The aim of our session is to identify strategies that organizations can use to increase employee diversity. So as the first speaker, I will share how organizations can use the default effect as a nudge to reduce gender and race bias in the hiring context. Our second speaker is Professor Eden King from Rice University, who will discuss nudges that can help increase employees' inclusive behaviors towards minorities. Our third speaker is Professor Astrid Holman from the University of Amsterdam. She will share with us how multicultural experiences can help employees develop diversity competencies, such as intercultural competence. Our last speaker is Elizabeth Silver, a PhD student at Rice University, who will share her research on the conditions under which majority group members enact reverse discrimination in reaction to diversity policies. So before I begin, this PowerPoint presentation was made possible by the contribution of my collaborators, Assistant Professor Zhiyu Feng from Renmin University of China, and Associate Professor Krishna Savani of Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. There is widespread discrimination against women and minorities in the hiring process. Resumes with names belonging to the majority ethnic group receive about 50% more callbacks for interviews than identical resumes with names belonging to minority groups, while male applicants are rated as more competent and more hireable than comparable female ones. So this is an important issue because studies have shown that companies with more diverse employees are more profitable, and employees in companies that engage in hiring discrimination have higher turnover intentions and decreased job satisfaction. Organizational practices have been shown to alleviate or even reverse biases in hiring. So for example, partition dependence, a nudge identified by Feng and colleagues, was shown to increase inclusive behaviors. So building on this work, the present research identifies another choice architecture intervention, the default effect. So what is it? When certain options are designated as the default, people are more likely to choose default over non-default options. Theory posits that it might be due to inertia or laziness, that is, switching to a non-default option requires thought and effort. Or it may be due to the implicit endorsement of the default effect of the default rule, that is, default options are perceived to be a good option. So for example, the default contribution to an organization's 401k retirement plan has a positive relationship with the proportion of new employees contributing to the retirement plan. And in the decision-making literature, biases are generally seen to be a bad thing. So for example, people who demonstrate the naturalness and omission biases in hypothetical scenarios make worse real-world decisions, to the extent that declining a free flu vaccine is a worse real-world decision. People who demonstrate the naturalness, So under the influence of biases, example, the availability bias, individual investors often make irrational investment decisions. So thus, my collaborators and I wanted to examine whether the default bias can be used to counteract gender bias in the workplace, specifically the personnel selection. That is, setting female applicants as the default options. So specifically, I would like to examine whether the default bias can be used to reduce gender inequality in the workplace. So in our first experiment, we hypothesized that participants in the, so in my first experiment is an experimental study. So we have two conditions, default versus control. And we hypothesized that participants in the default condition will choose more female candidates than those in the control condition. So they will be provided this list of shortlisted candidates with their information. So as you can see, the names which indicate the gender, the school, and their GPA. So if they're assigned to the default condition, they will see that 4 candidates have already been selected for them. Note that they can change the options if they wish to. So I was able to find evidence that by setting female candidates as the default, participants are more likely to hire more women. And so our follow-up question is, when is this effect most prominent? Recall that the theory posits that even when people are lazy, or they think that the default option is the good option, they will stick to the default. So for our second experimental study, we hypothesized that those in the default condition will choose more female candidates than those in the control condition, which is similar to study 1. But this effect will be stronger when the perceived effort is higher and when they perceive that the implicit recommendation is higher. So there are 2 conditions. Those in the control condition receive no additional instructions, while those in the default condition will read that an AI recruiting tool that the company uses has recommended the 4 candidates. And then they will be instructed on which resumes the candidates are. And as noted, they are free to choose any of the 4 candidates. So like I mentioned, at the end, after they have reviewed all their resumes, they are showed the list of the 16 candidates, and then they are told to choose any 4 which they would like to interview. And then after which, they are asked to complete 2 skills, the implicit recommendation scale and the effort scale. A sample item of the implicit recommendation reads, I choose the candidates that I thought my company would want me to choose, while a sample item of effort scale is, I chose these candidates because they were the easiest to choose. So the outcome measure is the same as study 1. So as with study 1, I was able to find a significant main effect where participants in the default condition are more likely to select more women than those in the control condition. I was able to find a significant moderating effect of effort, but not for the implicit recommendation. So this interaction graph revealed that those who scored low on the effort scale seem to be deliberating carefully about who to choose and are not affected by the default manipulation, while those who score high on the scale, on the other hand, are affected. So without the default bias, without the default effect, they seem to be the most biased, but with the condition, they seem to be the least biased. So now that we have established that the default bias has an effect on hiring of female candidates, we wonder if it applies to diversity in general. So especially when research has shown that ethnic minorities are also discriminated in the workplace. So remember, I mentioned that CVs with African American names are less likely to receive callbacks compared to those with white names. So we ran another experimental study, and this time we hypothesized that those in the default condition will choose a more diverse pool of candidates than those in the control condition. So I ran the exact same experiment as with study 1, but swapping gender for race. So the names of the candidates hint to their ethnicity. We have three groups, white, Latinos, and blacks. As we study 1 and 2, I was able to find a main significant effect, whereby those in the default condition chose more diverse candidates than those in the control condition. So with this, we were able to introduce the default bias to the personnel selection literature. We demonstrate that the default effect can provide an advantage to women and racial minority applicants when it comes to personnel selection context. And next, the decision-making literature typically frame biases as bad, but in our presentation, we demonstrate that we can turn the biases to our advantage. So in this case, we use one bias in the decision-making literature to cancel out another biases in hiring. And lastly, these studies also suggest an effective and low-cost intervention to counteract bias in personnel hiring. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I would appreciate it if you have any feedbacks or suggestions to improve our studies. Thank you.
Hello. I have a mic here, so if you raise your hand, I'll come run and give it to you. Okay.
Was my experiments perfect? That's why no one had.
No, not at all. I need it.
Just one quick question regarding the second, I think it's second experiment.
Yeah.
So about the diversity one, so how do the, so they tell the diversity ethnicity based on their names?
Mm-hmm.
This act is in basic when you judge people's ethnicity based on their names can be a kind of discrimination act toward the applicant?
Sorry, I don't quite get. Can you?
I'm just wondering, like, if judging one person's ethnicity based on their names can be problematic.
So I just want to clarify. So with the resumes, right? Because we don't want to be too obvious by highlighting people's ethnicity or gender, so we do that by demonstrating that in their names. So by looking at the names, you can kind of know like which ethnicity they belong to, and that is deliberate because I mean that's what you will get in your like during hiring you get all those resumes, right? And then supposedly because you see those names and you associate their gender or their race with it, and then you form this stereotypical bias. So that was deliberate. Yeah, thank you for your question. Anyone else?
In like your first experiment, you found an effect for one thing, but then didn't find an effect for the other. I don't remember which one was which now.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
Oh, so in the first experiment, I think you found an effect for one of your hypotheses, but like only partially. The one that you weren't able to find a significant effect, did you have a theory as to why?
So for that, our aim was kind of to, so that was because for the theory regarding default effect or biases, all the scholars have posited that there are two possible reasons why people don't switch out of the default options. So one of it was it was too much effort on my part to do that. And another is that, oh, if it's the default option, then it must be great. So in that experiment, we kind of try to see which one of it actually matters, because from what I have read, all these reasonings were just posited. No one really tested it. So through that, it was kind of like competing both of them together. And then we were only able to find a significant effect for effort, but not for like the implicit endorsement. But again, it's just one study.
Right.
Yeah, but that's what we found. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Or if anyone's interested in Singapore? No? Okay, thank you so much for your attention. I'm going to pass it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us on Saturday morning at 8 a.m. of the SciUp conference. It is an honor to be presenting this work, which was really led, I should not be the first author here, I think, at all. It's the work of newly doctored Isabel Bellata, who is not able to come today, but she did this amazing project in collaboration with some wonderful people at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and so I want to recognize all of these wonderful people who have helped us to explore these questions that I hope you will find inspiring and or invoke your curiosity, because it's definitely prompting us to think more deeply about behavioral change in response to diversity and inclusion initiatives. So we started this project with MD Anderson, which is an organization that prides itself in doing deep diversity work. So they have a multitude of programs, practices, policies that are meant to create an inclusive workplace. And they wanted to find ways to further create persistent and sustainable change. So whereas many organizations, including some that I've worked for, sort of put in a 1-hour diversity training session and move on until the next year. This is an organization that has done many more things. And so we went in with the idea that of the question of how can we help the initiatives they're already doing get even better or have more persistent or sustainable change. And so we went in with this idea of using nudges. So the behavioral economics literature talks about tiny hints or changes which push individuals in one direction while simultaneously leaving other options open to them, allowing them freedom of choice. So nudges are really about changing the choice architecture. So some of the quintessential examples are like having, in cafeterias, having smaller plates rather than larger plates available so that people will eat less food. We went into it with that idea and wanting to see whether we could create an architecture that would support inclusive behaviors. The theory of nudges and this notion of choice architecture doesn't translate directly into the specifics of our study, but that's where we started. So we're sort of using that loose notion of a nudge to try to create change here. And some of that, as we heard in the previous talk, is really about helping people to use easier processes, making it easier to make decisions or engage in behaviors that are inclusive without having to think about it or put effort into it. So using less effortful processing of information. We also hoped in doing that, we would increase motivation to respond without prejudice. And so we used those basic ideas together with some research that we and others have done on diversity training initiatives, so things that can be instituted within the diversity training itself to create positive outcomes, or to create more positive outcomes, which were specifically in this study goal setting and perspective taking. So in our prior work, we have used existing diversity training programs and basically just added another module that either pertains to goal setting or pertains to perspective taking. As many of y'all are aware, perspective taking involves quite literally putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. And the idea from the general perspective taking literature is that if you take a moment to think about what it's really like for somebody else, then that can help you develop a new sort of empathy in an affective way, but also shift your cognitive framing and understanding of other people. And so in our prior work, we have found that perspective taking as part of diversity training can have a positive impact on a variety of outcomes. We also have found that goal setting can be an effective strategy to further enhance the outcomes of training in diversity and otherwise. And so I'm sure y'all are aware of what that looks like, setting specific measurable goals that you personally choose. And here, of course, those goals are related to diversity. And so in our prior work, we did find that people who set goals around diversity were actually more likely to engage in behaviors that were consistent with those goals than people who didn't set goals. So we wanted to take this idea of nudges and put it together with these initiatives that we have seen some evidence can be helpful, and see if we can create persistent change over time. So the idea that we had was perhaps if we nudge people to do perspective taking or to do goal setting outside of a diversity training program itself, we might be able to encourage inclusive behaviors, and maybe that would actually change the culture. So we collaborated with this healthcare organization and conducted a 6-week experiment. So this was fall of 2020, and most everyone who participated was working remotely at the time. There was also an IT attack at the time of the study, so practical challenges arose. So we had originally designed a study that would be a random waitlist control. So in the first 3 weeks of the study, we thought half of the people who we were inviting to participate would be in the experimental group and the other half in the control group, and then we were going to switch it in weeks 4 to 6. We did that, but it turns out the first 3 weeks were awash because nobody was getting our emails because of this IT attack. So that's the bit of fun of doing research in the field, as many of y'all know. But we did use the data from weeks 4 to 6, in which we provided nudges on Monday and Wednesday of each week, and then we measured self-reports of inclusive behaviors on Friday of each week. And we ended up with 483 employees participating and 704 data points. This is an easier way to see exactly what we did. So in the experimental group in week 4, on Monday and Wednesday, they received a nudge via email to take a moment and think about the perspective of someone else. So very explicitly, we want you to spend just a few minutes today doing this behavior. And then on the Friday, they responded to the dependent variable measures. And then the next week, on Monday and Wednesday, they got this goal setting nudge. So take a few minutes and think about a goal you have for today. What would you like to do behaviorally to support diversity and inclusion? And then on week 6, we did both. So on Monday and Wednesday, they got one, either perspective taking or goal setting. So they got both that week. We wondered whether maybe having both experiences in the same week would have a bolstering effect. So maybe it's, a little bit of everything that actually makes it most effective. And in the control group, Monday and Wednesday had no nudges, but Friday they experienced the same measures. So in a sense, you might interpret that as a weak control, because they were still getting the reminder to fill out questions about their inclusive behaviors every week, because that was the dependent variable. But we were able to use that as our best control. So overall, the results of this work suggested that, let me orient you here. So on the bottom are the different weeks 4, 5, and 6. And the dependent variable here is the average self-report inclusive behaviors. And the nudge group is in the lighter blue shade. And you can see, especially in week 4, there was a positive effect of the nudges on self-reported inclusive behaviors. So it does seem from these analyses that the nudges did have a positive impact. And that did persist over the 6 weeks, even though the biggest one was at the first. We also we explored some demographic variables that might influence the strength of these effects. We didn't find any effects for participant ethnicity or level in the organization or age, but we did find this interaction with gender, where the nudges seem to be actually only really helpful for women, which we didn't hypothesize, but is interesting from a post hoc perspective. It seems that women were the most open or responsive to these nudges. We also examined the different strategies. So here you can see that perspective taking week 4 is plotted versus goal setting week 5 versus the combination. And you can see that there wasn't a whole lot of variability in terms of which of the interventions were most helpful. But there was some reason to believe that the perspective taking may be particularly helpful. This is another way to plot the data to kind of get a sense of the magnitude of the difference. So the dependent variable was measured with a frequency anchor. So how often did you engage in these behaviors this week? And so Izzy plotted these results for people who basically said, I didn't do any of these things, so 0 inclusive behaviors versus 1 or more inclusive behaviors. And you can see that in each week, perspective taking week, goal setting week, combination week, you can see that the lighter blue nudge group was more likely to engage in the 1 or more inclusive behaviors than the no nudge group. And the no nudge group was more represented in the 0 inclusive behaviors bucket. These are, so this was the actively included people from different demographic groups variable item on inclusive behaviors. This is trying to understand people from different demographic groups, treated people from different demographic groups respectfully, and encouraged others to avoid biased behaviors. So just again, she wanted you to have a sense of what each of these different behavioral outcomes look like, and they all look pretty similar, that the nudge group is outperforming the no nudge group with regard to the extent to which people were engaging in these behaviors every week. So that reflected on each of the items in this behavioral measure of inclusion. So, in summary, we think this is some preliminary evidence to suggest that nudging employees may be an effective way to try to keep them engaged in the process. In some ways, it may be a form of accountability for the kinds of efforts that are already ongoing. So just kind of reminding people, like, hey, you did this diversity training program last week, and now we want you to keep thinking about those things. It doesn't stop when you walked out the door. And so maybe encouraging people, reminding them, and holding them accountable to some extent could facilitate inclusive behavior change with minimal investment. This was just a series of emails. And in an ideal world, we would have had in-person interactions to reinforce these behaviors and to allow people to think more deeply and engage more deeply in the interventions, right? But given the very sort of minimal investment required and the positive change we did see, we are hopeful that this may be something that could be expanded upon. We did see some evidence that goal setting was particularly valuable, but also perspective taking, so I don't think we can take away from this particular study that one particular strategy is way better than another, and the combination didn't seem to outperform the others in a robust manner. So I think that is a topic that still needs more exploration as well. We need to understand not just do nudges work, but which nudges work. And we ideally would also have longer-term outcomes measured. We also hope to continue to work with this organization to look at the impact that the leaders had on their followers using these same kind of data. Each of the individuals is nested within a supervisor who also got nudges. So it would be really exciting to see the trickle-down sort of effects from supervisors to their subordinates, with the idea being that maybe our shared experience of nudges and these reminders and accountability could help create this culture over time. And so we'd love to do that as well. And as I said, I think I see this as we did very little. We just sent emails. So if we can do more, like the face-to-face and the deeper moments, then I think we really do have an opportunity to create some real change. And so to me, that's the most exciting part of this, is doing just a little bit, you get something out of it. So what if we did a lot? So I'm gonna thank you for your time, and I'm gonna say, contact Izzy if you have any questions, except if you have some right now.
Hello. Thank you, Eden. I had a quick question, and apologize if you already covered this, but for when you were sending the nudges for both the goal setting and perspective taking, did you provide kind of examples, or as far as who they could take the perspective of, or what different goals could be?
And I am trying to remember. I think we just kept it very general. We wanted to match it with the dependent variable, which was very general. And so we were talking about inclusion in a very broad way. Do you have a thought about what it would be?
Well, it's just funny because at McKinsey, so I'm one of Eden's former grad students, but at McKinsey I was actually working on some inclusion nudges, so it's super cool to see that y'all have been doing this work as well, and would love to talk to Izzy a little bit more about it. But I feel like for us, we tried to make some of the things very concrete, right, as far as and then it kind of gets into questions of what's a nudge versus just telling someone what to do.
Right.
But with respect to this, I think what I was thinking is the cognitive load, right, as far as if I have to sit and think and come up with something, which then, right, if you provide examples, that can also, right, guide people in a way that maybe you want them to come up with their own. But it was just something I was thinking about and curious about the approach that y'all took.
Yeah, so in this one we definitely were general, but in some of the other work we've done, we have tried, I think less intentionally than you're describing, but we have given examples. So what might a goal look like when it comes to inclusion? What are you really talking about? Or which group do you want me to take the perspective of? So in one study we actually considered, we asked people to take the perspective of someone who was a different sexual orientation than they were, or we asked them to take the perspective of someone who was a different race or ethnicity than they are. And we were interested in whether the potential positive effects would generalize. And so basically, if you had the LGBT perspective taking, would you have also more positive attitudes afterwards towards other groups or racial minorities? And we were interested in whether that crossover would happen. It didn't happen in our data, which suggests to me that, maybe really the specificity might matter, the alignment between what you're actually trying to change and what you're prompting.
Yeah, but it is cool that y'all are already seeing some of these effects and then can continue to kind of explore different avenues like you mentioned, so thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what other forms of nudging have you all considered outside of the emails?
It's really hard to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you say, no, it's not you. Did you say what other forms of measures?
Yes, what other forms of measures besides using emails for nudging have you considered?
So when we originally approached the organization, we wanted to basically have the leaders engage sort of in the morning huddle or whatever that many healthcare organizations engage in, depending on the nature of the team. We wanted the leader to basically huddle up their team and just say, hey, let's take a minute and just think about what it's like. So we wanted it to be an in-person, face-to-face accountability and, like, I guess, social experience. But yeah, we were unable to do that. I think that would come with other challenges, right? Like the relationship with your supervisor, the awkwardness of being in that setting and trying to have that moment. But that was the other approach we had in mind. I think, even just something different like text messages that prompt you to do something, sort of along the lines of a pulse survey, but in this case, a pulse nudge may be another option. We were not able to get phone numbers, but we did talk about that as well. Do you have any other ideas? I'd love to hear them.
The text message thing was my thought, because I know, for example, like even all of us in here, you have your phone on you 24/7, and I just feel like we respond probably quicker to a text message in most cases than an email. Right?
Yeah, we definitely had that same thought, and that was just private information. But I think that would be great to try that. And we also, I should have said, we had the CEO of the organization at the beginning of the study sent a video message to the company describing the overall commitment to inclusion, and didn't directly reference the study, but sort of set it up for us. So we also thought about trying to do more around video messaging throughout, just increasing the sort of social component to engage people more deeply.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can think of, off the top of your head, any contextual factors that might make these nudges more or less effective in certain organizations. So does it have to happen in an organization that already has some sort of diversity and inclusion, like training program, or could this be the first step for that for an organization?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. So what I heard is contextual effects and that may influence the effectiveness of this kind of intervention, and also whether doing this first before you try to do other things could be a reasonable approach. I hadn't thought about that. Certainly there are contextual effects, and that's why I thought it was important to explain that this is a company that is really trying on these areas. And I wonder about the perceived authenticity of an intervention in a different kind of context, or feeling some, I guess, for lack of a better word, like backlash to being asked to do this in addition to everything else they're asking me to do. So in a high pressure context or in a psychologically unsafe context, there may be contexts where this actually has a negative impact, right? Asking me to do, sometimes I feel like that. I'm like, you're asking me to do something else, I'm already doing these 10 things, So I could definitely see contexts where it would be adding to the burden. But I wonder, and I think it could be cool. I love the idea of just thinking beyond the 1 hour training. And I was thinking the after part, but I love the idea of thinking the before part, right? Like setting people up, like giving them information, having them reflect on stuff before they go and have conversations about it. So I think there could be some really cool opportunities for pre-training reflection. I don't know that these particular strategies would make sense. Maybe the perspective taking could in that context. I love those ideas.
Well, and kind of to the point of the question earlier, if people in an organization don't know how to take that perspective because they aren't familiar with that particular group, I mean, I would think it maybe would be less effective for those types of individuals because they don't know what to think about when you nudge them in such a general way like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's hard. It can be cognitively demanding and sometimes impossible, really, to know what it's like. But to me, that's actually part of it. So if I sit down and I'm trying to take the perspective of someone who just grew up in a different country, for example, I take a minute and I think, oh, that's hard. You know, like, what is it like? And so just asking those questions of myself in that moment, even if I don't know what to say, I do think that is part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, I think it's time. Thank you for your patience with me as I present somebody else's awesome work.
Well, good morning, everyone here, and good day to everyone watching this at home. I'm assuming there are people watching this. There's a big camera, so I hope it's not for nothing. There is some echo on the stage, so if I don't understand your question, if you have a question later on, it's not you, it's me. So just so you know. I want to thank Ruling and Krishna for getting together this wonderful symposium with those great talks. Already learned a lot, so that's really wonderful. And I want to talk about some work that is very different from what I normally do. I study diversity for a very long time now, but I've never only done cross-sectional studies, so I'm really curious to hear what you think and how we can improve this work. And I'm doing this together with someone who is in practice, that is Ursula Brinkman, and she is the founder of a company where they're really trying to help companies to become better in managing intercultural interactions at work. And a lot of these studies were actually done by my students, my undergraduate students, because the students that I have are really interested in diversity. And one of the things that they read was that going abroad, so having multicultural experiences, might actually be really good for them, because as Eden also net talked about, this might help them to better understand how other people live and where they come from. So that was sort of the general idea. And we wanted to see how those multicultural experiences, and especially going abroad, how that would influence the development of intercultural competence. So how good are you in dealing and interacting with people from different cultures? So the general idea of diversity management is a big one, right? We heard a lot already. I really loved the two previous talks, and Elizabeth will have a very nice final talk. I'm looking forward to hearing hers as well. But there's a lot going on, and I think a lot of those initiatives are structural, so like policies, practices, maybe also the biases that you talked about, using those, nudges, diversity training. There's also a lot on the cultural front, so how can we create diversity ideologies and nudge people to like diversity better, show more inclusion, and also stuff like leadership. So a lot of top-down like initiatives, and we were interested, how can we develop the individuals actually having to do the work, the employees, to be better able to deal with interacting with diverse others, and then specifically cultural diversity. And we know already from the literature, Nisha already talked about this, that there's a great importance of the ability, motivation, opportunity of the individuals in the company to be able to deal with all those more structural approaches. If you don't know how to do it, it's very difficult for you to do. So we focus on the individual. What can the individual do to become a better intercultural competent person? So what is intercultural competence? It's actually a pretty big term. There have been over 30 models already published in the literature about intercultural competence. I'm not going to go through all of them, and we focus on some measurements. So there might be others out there that are also interesting to focus on, but we haven't done 30 studies yet, so we haven't done that. So, but it's an individual's ability to function effectively across different cultures. So how effective is an individual in using knowledge, skills, and personal attributes in order to work successfully with people from different national cultural backgrounds, either at home or when going about themselves? And when looking at all these models, there seem to be 3 domains in which you can sort of measure intercultural competence. And those are traits. So those are more related to how do people in general respond when they are in an intercultural interaction. Worldviews and attitudes, so what type of, are they positive or negative about these interactions? and capabilities. So things like skills and knowledge, linguistic skills is one that is in this domain. And our idea was that going abroad might help to develop these things in individuals. And there has been quite some work on multicultural experiences, not necessarily related to intercultural competencies, but to areas that have something to do with intercultural competencies. I think most of the research started in the creativity area, and they found that people who have more multicultural experiences become more creative. So they get a more flexible mindset. There's also some research showing that going abroad lowers stereotyping and discrimination. So there's this positive diversity-related outcomes as well. And there's also a study that found that diverse teams that have more members with multicultural experiences actually perform better. So it seems to be that it does something with how people handle diversity. Of course, when you think about going abroad or having those intercultural contacts that multicultural experiences are, that should lead to learning and awareness and skills associated with interacting with diverse others. So the research question that we had based on these 3 cross-sectional data set is just a general question. Indeed, are multicultural experiences, and we operationalize this as going abroad. I know there's different ways to operationalize this, but this is how we did it. Are they positively associated with intercultural competencies? And we had 2 studies in which we wanted to see whether there are factors that could make that relationship more positive. The first one we focused on was depth. There has been in the literature this distinction between going to a lot of different countries, which is breadth, and also depth, staying in one country for a longer period of time. So you really get yourself immersed in that culture. And we actually measured immersion in study 2. So how immersed were you? And we know also from the literature that multicultural experiences might be very nice, but there might also be people who have very negative experiences. And what does that do to people? It might not work. So we operationalized that with friendship ties. So we assumed that if people have more intercultural friendship ties, they would have more positive appraisals of those interactions, and as a result, going abroad might be more effective for you in developing those intercultural competencies. So in the first study, we had a sample of students, and as you will see, both in study 1 and study 2, those are student samples, psychology students, so we have a lot more women than men. We find a gender effect in the first study, but not in the other 2 studies, so to get that out of the way. And we measured how long people went abroad. Students went abroad, and this was going abroad for their studies. So we weren't really interested in vacation, but really sort of living there for a relatively longer period of time. And we categorized this variable into more than 6 months or less than 6 months going abroad because the variable is very skewed, and this was the way sort of we could make it statistically correct to do analysis with it. We controlled for a lot of things because, of course, you can say going abroad might be correlated to a bunch of things that might be more predictive of this than just going abroad as a student. So we controlled for sex, for age, for openness to experience, which is likely to be correlated to being open to going abroad, living abroad while growing up, so being younger as a child, attending international education while growing up, and also socioeconomic status, because we thought that it might be more likely that people with higher socioeconomic status would have the opportunity to go abroad. And indeed, these factors explain 31% variance in intercultural competence, so they are good predictors. So we looked at how much the going abroad variable would add, and it does add significant variance. So that was sort of our idea. Okay, this does something in addition to it. You might say, well, it's not very big, but still, I think this is something that we might stimulate in people, whereas the other things might be more difficult to change. So in the second study, we focused on a factor that we think would actually help going abroad to be more positively related to intercultural competence, and that is immersion. So how much do you put yourself into that culture? Again, we had, these were adults, but they were mostly students because it was a snowball sample that the student found. And here we had to have a cutoff point at 8 weeks of multicultural experience or less. So one is more and the other one is less. And we controlled for sex, age, the reason for stay. So was this for work or for study, or in this case also vacation, and cultural distance. So how far away do you felt that the culture was from your original culture? So people might say, well, if you go to Germany when you live in the Netherlands, like I do, if you go to Germany, yeah, it doesn't really create a lot of cultural distance. I'm not sure if it does, but yeah, it didn't matter. That's what I'm trying to say. So if you control for it, it doesn't matter if you don't control for it. The effects are the same. And the student and I made this cultural immersion scale, which was actually based on a immersion in video games, which is a very cool field. If you have never read that, that's really interesting. So we looked at those items and we thought it was really nice because we could sort of map it onto going abroad. And then, of course, we again looked, is there this direct relationship between going abroad and intercultural competence? And indeed, that's what we found. We also found a main effect of cultural immersion. So those who immerse more in the culture, they also have a higher level of intercultural competence. But we also looked at the interaction between the two. And we found a significant interaction, and it looks like this. So for those who stay abroad longer, so that's more than 4 weeks, 8 weeks or more, immersion doesn't really do anything in addition in being positively associated with intercultural competence. But for those who stay abroad for a shorter period of time, for them this seems to stimulate their intercultural competence. So I think that's good news, because that doesn't mean that everyone has to go abroad for months and months. We can also do it shorter, as long as you immerse yourself in that culture. So in the final study, we focused on the role of friendship, because we thought that might create sort of this positive affect, or this positive salience towards intercultural meetings and exposures. This was a sample that we got from the company that Ursula works at. And these were data from people who fill out their intercultural competence measure. We had more men here, as you can see, so the sample was more evenly distributed. And again, we dichotomized people here with multicultural experience, so going abroad, and people without. So they didn't have, they indicated to not have been going abroad. Again, we controlled for a bunch of things, in this case also for language of survey, because the company sets out these surveys in a lot of different countries in the world. And there was one item measuring intercultural friendship ties. I have many friends from a different cultural background who live abroad. Again, we find a main effect of going abroad and intercultural competence, a positive one. We also find a main effect of intercultural friendship. So those individuals who indicate to have more intercultural friendships indeed also score higher on intercultural competence. But we also find an interaction between the two. And this interaction, I think, is very interesting to look at, because it shows you something different from the immersion findings. So to the degree that people have more multicultural experiences, they indeed experience more intercultural competence, but the difference is more in the people who have no multicultural experiences. So if they indicate to have friends, maybe those friends came to the Netherlands at some point, or to wherever they were living, and they interacted with them and they moved back, those people actually benefited from those friendships. So without going abroad, they also created more intercultural competence in them. And if you look at this part of the figure, so even for those who had a lot of multicultural experiences, if they didn't really have those friendship ties, it didn't really help them to develop those intercultural competencies. And it might be due because they don't have that positive experience with going abroad, because they didn't really get into contact with people who they still see, or they still like to see. So, as a conclusion, multicultural experiences was related to intercultural competence. This was over and above other potential correlates. Immersion seems to help, so sort of going deep into a culture to overcome shorter-term experiences. And intercultural friendships were associated with intercultural competence, even for those who didn't go abroad. So it really helps to create sort of a group of intercultural friends around you. Of course, these were cross-sectional data, so there is no causality. I can show you this. It's difficult to manipulate, to send some people abroad and some people to not go abroad, but it's interesting to think about how we can do that. We have different organizations of going abroad, so we don't really know what the timing is. So is 8 weeks enough? It seems to be. Is 6 weeks enough? Is 4 weeks enough? We don't really know. But at the same time, we do show these effects over different time frames, over studies. So what does this mean for practice? Well, I've been talking to my university a lot and saying, okay, maybe we should stimulate those multicultural experiences for students. And those don't have to be for months and months. We can also send them abroad for a shorter period of time and really let them go through an immersion in that culture, because that might help them to build these very important competencies. And you can, of course, use it as a possible selection criteria, or as a company, you can ask people to do this. I always like to be balanced in my talk, so I don't want to say that multicultural experiences are only good. There has been some research published lately by Jackson Liu, where they found that going abroad created some moral insensitivities. So people, their moral compass is a little bit off, so everything becomes more flexible. So I think it's really good to study this further and see how we can sort of take all the benefits of going abroad, while at the same time avoiding that there's also negative consequences of doing this. So thank you very much for your attention, and I want to thank my students for collecting the data for me. There's a question here. Yeah, I can hear you. I think it's better than the mic.
I was really interested in your concept of the friendships. And when you first started talking about it, my assumption was that you were going to talk about the friends that you make while you are in an intercultural experience. But the way that it was measured was having friends who also go abroad.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that? What was the thinking there?
Well, in this case, this was what they measured, so we were sort of locked into their survey, but I completely agree. That was how we started thinking about it. So if you go abroad and you make a lot of friends, that is something that creates a positive feeling towards that multicultural experience, and that would help. So in that sense, the theory seems to be a little bit off, but I do find it interesting that even if you don't go abroad and you make those friends in your home country, it seems to help. So maybe it's just a general having intercultural friendships. But I completely agree. This wasn't how we started to think about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's about broadening your sense of the world.
Exactly.
Through your friends.
Yeah. And I think it's also connected to multicultural experiences, right? So we operationalize it as going abroad. But I think in general they would say that any interaction with a culture that is different from your own culture could help. So it makes sense that we also find the main effect of those friendship ties. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's really hard to send people to abroad to experience the multicultural experience. I'm just wondering, is it possible to bring the multicultural experience to the people? In your organization, we can set a week as a cultural week, so people experience certain culture, taste certain foods. Will that be helpful to increase people's intercultural competencies?
I'm really sorry. It's just the echo. So I'm going to come down to you, and maybe you can just ask me the question without the microphone.
Just make sure to repeat the question afterwards so we can hear.
I will repeat it, yeah.
So my question is that it's really hard to send people abroad to experience multicultural experience. Can we bring multicultural experience to the people? We design certain
Okay, that's a great question. So the question is, it might be difficult to send people abroad, get them out of the country, but maybe we can bring the multicultural experiences to the people. And I think that's an excellent point, and I do think it will work. Maybe the Netherlands, maybe also the US, are slightly different in that we do stimulate students, for instance, to go abroad for like a semester. So I do think that that could be a way to do it, but it makes sense to do it. I do think there needs to be a lot of immersion in the culture. So just one day, I don't think will work, but I think you need a sort of a prolonged immersion in that experience. So maybe like a 3-week festival would be very interesting to set up. So yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Silver. I'm a doctoral student at Rice University, and today I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis research, which examines the effects of diversity, ideology, and economic threat on anti-white discrimination claims. I wanted to open with this quote from Texas Senator Ted Cruz when he said, quote, "Critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets." And I chose to open with this quote because I think it really shows how concerns about anti-white discrimination have really risen to national prominence in recent years, particularly amid increasing diversity and efforts for racial justice. In fact, many conservative state legislatures have just outlawed anti-racism education, citing worry specifically about fomenting anti-white bias. So clearly, there seems to be some backlash to diversity and inclusion efforts that is centered around the idea that these shifts will lead to anti-white discrimination. And this leads into the overarching question of this research, namely, what is the relationship between social context and formal claims of anti-white employment discrimination? And just to orient you to the bigger picture contribution of the current work, past research in this space has largely focused on the impact of individual level beliefs on anti-white discrimination concerns. By contrast, the current research examines the effect of aggregate level social context on anti-white discrimination claiming behavior. And I'm going to accomplish this by drawing from 2 theoretical frameworks, integrated threat theory and socio-ecological psychology. So first, integrated threat theory builds on this foundational assumption that relative group size signals information about social status. So groups that are bigger tend to be associated with higher status. And this means that when group sizes shift, threats to a group's social status can foster solidarity with in-group members and prejudice toward out-group members. Integrated threat theory also makes predictions about 2 specific kinds of threat: symbolic threats and realistic threats. So symbolic threats are perceived threats to the in-group's worldview or the values that justify a group's social status. So in the US, an example of these values is the belief that America is a meritocracy and group differences are the fair result of a just system. And this constellation of beliefs is referred to by scholars as conservative status legitimizing beliefs. Realistic threats, on the other hand, are a bit more straightforward. These are threats to the in-group's access to tangible resources, so things like jobs, money, and political power. And research largely supports the predictions made by integrated threat theory, finding that information about increasing racial diversity increases white people's concerns about anti-white discrimination, both directly and indirectly, by creating a sense of status threat. Research also suggests that people who endorse the conservative values that justify the racist status quo are more likely to respond to racial diversity with concerns about anti-white discrimination. And regarding realistic threats, research has found that white people who live in high white unemployment areas are more likely than white people who live in low white unemployment areas to respond to racially diverse neighborhoods with status threat. And these findings support integrated threat theory by demonstrating that threats to symbolic values and material resources can exacerbate the impact of racial diversity on white people's concerns about anti-white discrimination. So as I sort of alluded to, earlier, the research that I just reviewed largely focuses on the relationship between individual level perceptions and individual level concerns. But what I'm interested in is more macro level trends in behavior. And this is where socio-ecological psychology comes into play. So a socio-ecological approach to psychology involves explicitly considering how the economic, demographic, and ideological trends in a given environment relate to people's behavior. And this provides a great framework for testing whether the factors that are associated with anti-white discrimination concerns in lab settings actually translate to understanding behavior in actual workplaces. That is, making formal allegations of anti-white discrimination. So in the current research, I apply a socio-ecological lens to integrated threat theory to study how county-level demographic, ideological, and economic trends are associated with formal claims of anti-white discrimination. So getting into the hypotheses, first I expected that anti-white discrimination claims would be more prevalent in areas or counties with greater racial diversity. Hypothesis 2 predicted that the positive effect of racial diversity on anti-white claim prevalence would be stronger in more conservative areas than it would be in less conservative areas. So this is getting into the symbolic values piece. And finally, my third hypothesis suggested that the magnifying effect of conservatism on the relationship between racial diversity and anti-white claims would be stronger in areas with high white unemployment than it would be in areas with low white unemployment. So the idea here is that experiencing economic threat to the in-group, realistic threat to the in-group, will exacerbate these relationships. Okay, so just to briefly go over the methods. For my data set, I combined data from 3 separate sources to obtain my final sample. So the first data set was a data set of around 4 million EEOC complaints spanning 2005 through 2015. And I aggregated these claims at the county level. And as a dependent variable, I used the percent of claims in each county that were filed specifically for anti-white discrimination. And just for some background, overall, about 2.8% of all claims were filed for this reason. I then combined my geocoded EEOC dataset with regression estimated conservative policy preferences that are estimated at the county level, and these estimates were generated by political scientists using hundreds of thousands of responses to decades of policy surveys. And estimates on the conservatism measure range from -1 to +1, with greater scores indicating greater conservatism. And finally, to operationalize racial diversity and in-group material threat, I pulled estimates of these variables from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey. So specifically, I obtained white unemployment rates, and I calculated racial diversity as the percentage of people in a county that were from a racial or ethnic group other than non-Hispanic white. Okay, so getting into the results, the good part. Just to give you a reminder, my first hypothesis suggested that anti-white claims would be more prevalent in counties with greater racial diversity. And here you can see that this hypothesis seems to have been supported. We can see that on the x-axis, as the percent of people of color in a county increases, so too does the prevalence of anti-white discrimination claims. And just as a side note here, the y-axis is square root transformed to improve the normality of the residuals. So just to keep that in mind, these are not actual percentages because of that transformation. So, as I mentioned, hypothesis 1 was supported. Anti-white claims were indeed more prevalent in counties with greater racial diversity. So, getting into hypothesis 2, on this graph, we've separated out the effect of racial diversity on anti-white claim prevalence based on the level of conservatism in the county. So here, the red line indicates highly conservative counties, and the blue line indicates less conservative counties. And as you can see, the relationship between racial diversity and claim prevalence is positive in both lines. However, this positive relationship is significantly stronger in highly conservative counties than it is in less conservative counties. So basically, this means that hypothesis 2 was also supported. The association between diversity and claims was stronger in more conservative areas than it was in less conservative areas. And finally, we'll separate out the effect of racial diversity on claim prevalence, not only based on county conservatism, but also based on white unemployment. So I'm going to break this down into these two sides of the graph here. So let's start by looking at the low-weight unemployment counties. So in low-weight unemployment counties, the positive relationship between county diversity and claim prevalence was not significantly different between the high conservative counties and the low conservative counties. So in other words, the magnifying effect of conservatism on the diversity claims relationship is not seen in counties where material threat to white people is low. However, when we look at counties with high white unemployment, we see that the effect of racial diversity on claim prevalence is again significantly stronger in high conservative counties than it is in less conservative counties. And what this means is that hypothesis 3 was also supported. The magnifying effect of conservatism on the diversity claim relationship was significantly stronger in counties where material threat to white people was high compared to counties where material threat to white people was low. So, what does this all mean? Well, from a theoretical and a methodological perspective, I think this study is really cool because it's really the first study of factors associated with formal anti-white employment discrimination claims. And of course, as applied scientists, we are not just interested in how people think and feel, but also in how they behave. And using sort of macro level data can be a really unique way to kind of get into that. It also signals the importance of considering the broader context when we're studying workplace behavior. We don't just leave who we are and where we come from at the door when we go to work, and understanding how these external factors influence how we behave in the workplace is an exciting direction that I'm looking forward to continuing. And finally, this research demonstrates that big data need big theories. As our lives become increasingly digital, big data are becoming more and more available, and we know that organizations are using this. So it's important to kind of get creative about how we can provide more macro level perspectives on the theories that we've used for so long in order to really be able to keep pace. Now, from a practical perspective, these results suggest that, of course, documenting personnel decisions is required to protect against litigation. I think as a psychologist, that is not a hot take. And as well, having clear procedures surrounding personnel decisions can be really helpful in reducing the incidence of discrimination and increasing perceptions of procedural fairness. And this work also highlights the importance of meaningfully addressing racism against people of color in the workplace through creating inclusive and respectful climates, as well as high standards of ethical behavior, both of which are likely to redress discrimination against people of color, while also minimizing the risk of backlash from majority group members. And ideally, we could simply address racism in the workplace without worrying about majority group member backlash, but unfortunately, we know that that is not the case. So these new theoretical perspectives on how to sort of navigate that tension are really important, as my research seems to suggest. And finally, just very quickly to touch on some limitations and future research directions that I'm excited about. Of course, as with any administrative data study, there are potential data quality issues. I address this with rigorous geocoding and robustness checks, which I did not get into today, but would be happy to talk to you more about if you're interested. There's also the issue of potential mediators of the effects that I saw here. I particularly mentioned perceived status threat as an important variable in this space in the beginning of this talk, and that's, of course, a very slippery concept to try and measure at this aggregate group level. But that is something that I am really interested in exploring in future work. And finally, this research begs a question: have these patterns changed since our data set end in 2015? We all know that a lot has happened since 2015, so I would be very curious to see how these patterns may have changed or gotten stronger, that kind of thing. So just to sum up here, my research shows that anti-white discrimination claims are associated with threats to white people's majority status, economic status, and status legitimizing values. And as racial diversity increases and racial progress is made, understanding white people's status legitimizing behavior in response to these changes is only going to become increasingly relevant. So thank you to the faculty members at Rice who have supported this research on my committee, my master's thesis committee, our collaborator, Dr. Paul Tracy, the Rice IO community, and the NSF GRFP, which I learned very recently will be funding continued research on this project and many others. So thank you so much. I'd be happy to take questions.
Have you thought about investigating claims that the courts have found to be legitimate versus claims that the courts have found to be unfounded? Or what would maybe your hypotheses be about, legitimate versus unfounded claims, at least in the legal system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it kind of gets to the heart of a really important matter in discussing these claims, which is it's important to consider that the spirit of Title VII was to redress discrimination against people of color, particularly Black Americans and Indigenous Americans. So I think it's important when we're talking about, are these claims legitimate or not, to bring in the historical perspective of why these claims are even, legally possible to be brought. For the purposes of this study, I was not really interested in understanding what happens after the claim is made, because my primary research interest here is the perception of discrimination. However, that is definitely something that I have thought a lot about when doing this research, so thank you for that question. Okay, I will take your collective silence as a sign that there are no more questions. And would you like to wrap us up? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to all our speakers and our attendants for your participation. If there are no more questions, or if you think of any, please feel free to contact the respective speakers. If not, I guess we'll have an early break. Thank you, everyone.